Hello friends, please do like, subscribe, comment and share my video. That would be a great help. Thank you. In the early months of 2026, US foreign policy has intensified long-standing tensions manifesting in aggressive maneuvers towards Venezuela, Greenland and Cuba alongside escalating disputes with NATO allies. These actions, including the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife on January 3, 2026, renewed threats to annex Greenland, and warnings to Cuba about cutting off Venezuelan oil supplies, have been compounded by European responses such as France's draft resolution to exit NATO and Italy's reluctance to engage militarily against Russia in Ukraine. China's admonition against USA's unfounded claims over Greenland further underscores the multipolar strains. The United States' involvement has also extended to encouraging disturbances in Iran through public support for protesters and threats of military intervention, while its attitude towards China's recent aggression against Taiwan remains one of strategic ambiguity, which is bolstered by arms sales but lacking explicit defense commitments. The US military operation in Venezuela exemplifies brazen interventionism. On January 3, 2026, US forces captured Maduro and his wife in Caracas, framing it as a law enforcement action tied to narco-terrorism indictments from 2020 and 2026. Maduro, accused of leading the Cartel de los Soles, was extradited to the United States, where the president declared that the United States would run Venezuela temporarily to oversee a transition and access its oil reserves, which are the world's largest. This operation, involving airstrikes and special forces, resulted in over 100 deaths, including 32 Cuban officers aiding Venezuelan defenses. Critics, including the United Nations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, condemned it as a violation of sovereignty and international law, evoking memories of US dominance in Latin America. The US aggression towards Cuba has also escalated. Cuba, reliant on Venezuelan oil, about 35,000 barrels daily it takes from Venezuela, faces economic collapse amid US sanctions dating back to 1960. The POTUS, or the President of the United States, threatened Cuba with unspecified consequences if it does not make a deal explicitly cutting off Venezuelan resources. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel rejected talks, denouncing the United States of America's state terrorism. This builds on decades of embargo, which has cost Cuba billions. Yet the island maintains strong health and education systems despite adversity. The US push to annex Greenland has provoked outrage. Reviving the 2019 proposal, the president insisted in January 2026 that the US must own Greenland to counter Russia and China, warning of their potential takeover. A Republican bill, the Greenland Annexation and Statehood Act, authorizes the President of the United States to negotiate or use necessary steps for acquisition. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Fredrik Nielsen rejected this, affirming ties to Denmark and NATO. These actions reflect a US strategy prioritizing resource control and unilateral security, often bypassing international norms. US foreign policy in early 2026 has also played a significant role in aggravating the disturbances in Iran, where Widespread protests erupted in late December 2025 over soaring prices, currency collapse, and broader anti government sentiments. The unrest has reportedly resulted in over 500 deaths, including protesters and security personnel, amid a crackdown by Iranian forces. The American president has publicly incited the protests, posting on social media to urge Iranians to keep protesting, take over your institutions, and warning of strong action if the regime continues its crackdown. The US has imposed new sanctions, including a 25% tariff on countries conducting business with Iran, and cancelled diplomatic meetings until the violence stops. The United States is considering military options such as strikes on nuclear facilities or ballistic missile sites, as well as cyber attacks on Iran's domestic security apparatus, with officials indicating that any action is at least several days away. Perhaps it will be indefinitely postponed. Iran has accused the US of seeking to manufacture a pretext for military intervention. It has threatened to target US bases and Israel in retaliation. The US positions itself as supporter of regime change while risking broader regional escalation. In the Asia Pacific, the US attitude towards China's escalating aggression on Taiwan remains one of strategic ambiguity, which emphasizes deterrence through arms sales while avoiding firm commitments to direct intervention. China conducted its largest ever war games around Taiwan, dubbed Justice Mission 2025, on December 29-30, 2025, involving over 30 warships, 201 aircraft, and live rocket firings, simulating a blockade and counter intervention operations. These exercises, which are the most extensive by coverage area, were partly in response to a record $11.1 billion US arms package to Taiwan, including advanced F-16V fighters set for delivery by 2026, which Beijing condemned as provocative. Taiwan's National Security Bureau assessed the drills as an attempt to undermine global support for the island and divert attention from China's domestic economic issues. The US president has reiterated that peace in the Taiwan Strait is a vital US interest, but adhered to ambiguity, stating in interviews that any Chinese action would make him very unhappy and that it is up to Xi Jinping what happens, without specifying a US response. Analysts note that the US raid on Venezuela may provide China with narrative ammunition to justify territorial claims, although it does not meaningfully lower Beijing's threshold for invasion due to differing legal framings. This approach gives top priority to economic leverage over explicit military guarantees, potentially signaling US reluctance amid broader global commitments. US relations with NATO allies have reached a nadir over burden sharing and policy divergences. The present US administration has long criticized allies for underspending, claiming the United States covers 70% of NATO costs, a figure debunked as it includes total US defense spending, not just NATO specific contributions. In 2026, only a few allies meet the 2% GDP target, with cumulative shortfalls exceeding $800 billion since 2014. The American president's ambiguity on Article 5 commitments has sown doubt, prompting allies to question US reliability. France's response highlights the rift. On January 8, 2026, MP Clemence Guette submitted a draft resolution for a planned exit from NATO, citing US actions in Venezuela, Greenland, and Gaza as violations of alliance principles. While not yet debated, it echoes Macron's criticisms of NATO as brain dead and signals frustration with US unilateralism. Meanwhile, Italy rejects direct military action against Russia over Ukraine. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni affirmed Italy's support for Ukraine but ruled out troop deployments, advocating European talks with Russia. This reflects war fatigue and aligns with Macron's call for dialogue. These developments indicate a potential NATO collapse, with European nations exploring independent security arrangements amid United States of America's threats. US actions are disrupting global trade flows. In Venezuela, seizing oil assets, which are estimated at tens of billions to rebuild, could flood markets, but infrastructure decay limits output to 1.1 to 1.5 million barrels daily in the short term. This benefits US firms like Exxon but risks volatility. Sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba exacerbate shortages, with Cuba's economy teetering without Venezuelan oil. Greenland's minerals, especially rare earths, are critical for tech supply chains. US control could secure them against Chinese dominance. And we all know that China controls 60% of global supply. But forced annexation might trigger EU sanctions, disrupting transatlantic trade. NATO disputes fuel tariff threats. USA's reciprocal tariffs could dismantle WTO rules, raising costs and slowing global growth. In Iran, US tariffs on trading partners add pressure on global energy markets, potentially spiking prices amid threats of strikes on Iranian facilities. For Taiwan, US arms sales sustain semiconductor trade stability, but Chinese exercises risk supply chain interruptions, as Taiwan's role in global chip production amplifies economic vulnerabilities. Overall, these policies fragment trade, boosting bilateral deals while eroding multilateral stability. The US approach is fracturing alliances. NATO faces existential threats. France's exit draft and Italy's diplomacy signal a pivot towards autonomy. Greenland tensions have prompted UK, Germany, and France to consider troop deployments, viewing US threats as aggression. Denmark warns that this could end NATO. China's warnings highlight multipolar shifts, with Beijing positioning as a defender of sovereignty. Latin American alliances are strained. US intervention in Venezuela revives anti imperialist sentiments, bolstering ties among Cuba, Russia, and China. Europe may deepen EU defense integration, reducing US influence. In the Middle East, US threats against Iran risk alienating allies and could draw in Iranian backed militias in Iraq. In Asia Pacific, ambiguous US support for Taiwan may embolden China while eroding confidence among allies like Japan and Australia, potentially accelerating rival coalitions like those in the Indo Pacific. These fractures could lead to a realigned world order, with US isolationism accelerating rival coalitions. US policy is undermining UN efficacy. On January 7, 2026, the US administration withdrew from 66 international bodies, including 31 UN entities, citing waste and anti US agendas. This saves $430 million but ceded influence to China in climate, health, and development arenas. Venezuela's operation violated UN Charter sovereignty principles, drawing condemnation. Cuba's plight highlights UN rights failures amid US sanctions. Greenland disputes could erode UN territorial integrity norms. US encouragement of Iranian protests and threats of intervention further strained UN norms on non interference, with Iran's crackdown condemned but US actions seen as hypocritical. Regarding Taiwan, Chinese aggression challenges UN resolutions on peaceful dispute resolution, while US ambiguity weakens collective security mechanisms. Overall, US retreats weaken UN legitimacy, allowing adversaries to fill voids and diminishing global cooperation on trade, security, and crisis. US actions in Venezuela, Greenland, and Cuba, amid NATO rifts and China's warnings, have injected profound complexities into global geopolitics, which was further compounded by US involvement in Iran's disturbances through protest encouragement and intervention threats, and its ambiguous stance on China's Taiwan aggression amid arms sales and exercises. International trade faces disruptions from resource grabs and tariffs. Alliances with NATO risk dissolution, and UN institutions suffer from US disengagement. While advancing short term US interests, this approach may foster isolation, embolden rivals, and fragment the post World War II order. A balanced multilateralism could mitigate these risks, but current trajectories suggest turbulent realignments ahead. Thank you.